a soundstage at Batjack Productions, Burbank, California. The lights are off. Every grip, every camera operator, every gaffer has gone home for the night. The lot is quiet the way only a Hollywood studio goes quiet. That specific dead silence where the echo of 100 people still hangs in the air, but the people themselves are gone. And in the middle of that empty stage, sitting alone on an apple box with his boots flat on the concrete and his hat resting on his knee, is the biggest movie star in the world. 6'4", 220 pounds. The man audiences paid to watch stand in doorways and make other men feel small. He is crying. Not quietly. Not the polished, cinematic kind of tears that look good under Klieg lights. The kind of crying that bends a man forward. The kind that takes hold of a chest and doesn't let go. The kind that John Wayne, in 32 years of movie making, in front of directors and co-stars and 1,000 working cowboys, had never once allowed anyone to witness. Until tonight, one crew member had come back for a forgotten jacket. He stood in the shadow of the stage door for 11 seconds, long enough to see everything, and then he turned around and walked back into the dark without making a sound. He never spoke of what he saw, not to the press, not to colleagues, not even to his own wife, for more than 16 years. Why? What could bring a man like John Wayne to a moment like this? This is that story. To understand what happened on that soundstage in the autumn of 1960, you have to understand the ground John Wayne was standing on, and how much of it was shifting beneath his feet. Hollywood in 1960 was not the Hollywood that had made John Wayne. The system that built him, the big studios, the long-term contracts, the reliable machinery of westerns cranked out on a seasonal schedule, was fracturing at every joint. Television had eaten a third of the theatrical audience. The majors were shedding their back lots like dead skin. Republic Pictures, the studio where Wayne had spent the most formative decade of his career, had converted almost entirely to TV production. The old Cavalry Pictures, the Gene Autry serials, the serial westerns that had kept a generation of Saturday matinee kids in their seats, they were gone or going. And John Wayne was 53 years old. In the studio system, 53 was not simply an age. It was a conversation. It was the moment producers started doing quiet arithmetic, calculating how many more lead roles a man could carry before the numbers stopped working. Wayne had watched it happen to others. He had watched Gary Cooper, for years his senior, slow walk through his final performances with that gaunt, gray elegance. He had watched Errol Flynn, younger than Wayne, shockingly younger, dissolve in the decade before his death in 1959. Flynn had been buried at 50. Wayne had attended the funeral. These were not abstract thoughts. They pressed on a man. But the year 1960 was not a year of professional crisis for Wayne, not from the outside. From the outside, it looked like the opposite. The Alamo had just been completed. This was not simply a film. This was the project that had consumed 12 years of Wayne's life. 12 years of lobbying studios, of mortgaging his own production company, of rewriting financing deals when they collapsed, of scouting locations in Texas, of casting and recasting a story he believed in with a ferocity that people around him sometimes found difficult to distinguish from obsession. He had directed it himself, his first time behind the camera on a major production. He had starred in it as Davy Crockett. He had put his own money, roughly $1, $2 million of personal funds, into its production budget. The Alamo told the story of 189 men who chose to die rather than surrender a principle. That was not incidental. For Wayne, it was the point. The film was, in his own words, a statement about what America is. He had said so publicly, repeatedly, in interviews that ran in Life magazine and on the television programs that were, even then, beginning to absorb the cultural space that movies once owned entirely. He believed in it. He had staked his financial future on it. And he had, in the way that only a man of absolute conviction can persuaded himself that the rest of the country would believe in it too. The Alamo opened in October 1960. The reviews were mixed, some genuinely warm, some politely cool, and some that cut in ways that Wayne, who had made 153 films in his career without flinching at a single bad notice, was not prepared for. One New York critic called the film's patriotism elephantine. Another described Wayne's direction as serviceable but earthbound. The picture had cost approximately $12 million to produce and market. Its domestic box office returns in the first 6 weeks made it clear the film would not recoup. But it wasn't the money. Or rather, it wasn't only the money. Here is what very few people who worked around Wayne during that period were willing to say out loud. The Alamo had been personal in a way that none of his previous films had been. Not personal in the sense of autobiographical. Personal in the sense of a man pouring the philosophy of his entire life. The code by which he had organized everything he believed about courage, sacrifice, and the weight of principle into a single work, and then offering that work to the world to judge. The world had shrugged. And now it was autumn. And the production of his next picture, The Comancheros, was running behind schedule. And Wayne was tired in a way that sleep did not touch. And the stage was empty. And nobody was watching. But here's where it changes. The crew member who walked back onto that soundstage was a set electrician named Pete Salter. He was 26 years old in 1960, 3 years into his career at the studios, and he had worked on 4 of Wayne's productions. Enough to know what the man was like in working conditions, but not so long that he'd stopped paying attention. What he would describe years later, to his son and his son's wife at a dinner table in Reseda, was not what he expected to find. He expected to find nobody. Wayne, in Salter's experience, was the first person on set in the morning and among the last to leave, but not the last. The last people on a set were always the grips and electrics, closing up the infrastructure. Wayne did not linger. He came to work. He did his work with the kind of focused economy that made directors love him and lesser actors feel exposed. And he went home. He did not haunt his own sets. So when Salter pushed open the stage door and saw that the overhead work lights were still on, not the production lights, just the maintenance lights, a low yellowish glow that made everything look amber and slightly unreal. He assumed someone had simply forgotten to switch them off. He was 3 steps inside before he saw the shape of the man on the apple box. The size told him first. There was simply no other human being in the industry who occupied space in quite that particular way. The breadth of the shoulders, the length of the back, the specific geometry of a very large man trying to make himself smaller. Wayne was bent forward, elbows on knees, hat in both hands. His head was down. And then Salter heard the sound. Not loud. Almost nothing, acoustically a small, controlled, periodic exhalation with a catch in it. The sound of a man not quite succeeding at keeping something contained. He didn't move the way other men moved. Even in grief, there was something deliberate about his stillness, a quality that Salter, who would spend his whole career on sets and in the company of actors, could not later put a precise name to. It wasn't dignity, exactly. It wasn't performance. It was more like the stillness of a man who had never in his adult life surrendered his body to an uncontrolled state, and who was discovering at 53, on an empty soundstage, that the body sometimes claims what it is owed. Salter stood in the shadow of the stage door for 11 seconds. He counted. Later, he always said he counted, though he could never explain why. Only that it felt important to know how long he had stood there before he made his choice. 11 seconds. And then he took 1 step back and turned, and let the door close behind him without a sound. He never told anyone. Not because Wayne asked him not to. Not because anyone threatened him. Because in those 11 seconds, something had passed between 2 men without a single word being spoken. A compact, unspoken, instantaneous. And Pete Salter understood it the way a man understands a thing not with his mind, but with some older, more reliable instrument. He had seen something he was not supposed to see. And he had looked away. To understand why Wayne was on that soundstage, you have to go back 6 weeks. Back to the afternoon of September 14th, 1960, at the offices of United Artists on the corner of Santa Monica and La Pier in West Hollywood. The meeting had started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a Wednesday. Outside, the temperature was 87 degrees and the Santa Ana winds had been blowing since morning, carrying that particular dry heat that makes everything in Los Angeles feel slightly combustible. Inside, it was a different kind of heat. Wayne was there with his production partner and financial backer, Tex McCrary, and his attorney, Frank Belcher. Across the table sat the UA executives handling Alamo distribution. 3 men in suits whose names Wayne knew perfectly well and whose competence he had, until recently, trusted. The meeting was ostensibly about marketing strategy for the film's continued rollout. What it became was something else. One of the executives, a man who had been in the industry for 11 years, who had managed the distribution of 12 major pictures, and who spoke with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to having his analysis received without challenge, began presenting revised box office projections. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were worse than that. They were final. The film would not make its money back. The executive said this with the kind of clinical precision that people deploy when they want to communicate a fact without being accused of cruelty. He offered 3 scenarios: optimistic, baseline, and conservative. And in all 3, the numbers told the same story. Wayne sat across from him for the full 12-minute presentation without speaking. His attorney, Frank Belcher, later said he watched Wayne's face during those 12 minutes with the specific focus of a man who has known another man for a long time and is checking for something. He saw nothing. No color in the cheeks, no tightening around the jaw, no shift in the stillness of the eyes. Wayne simply listened. And then the executive made an error. He pivoted, in the way that certain businessmen do when they sense an opportunity in a man's silence, and began to discuss the film's philosophical ambitions. Specifically, the degree to which the Alamo's overt patriotic messaging had, in his view, limited its commercial crossover appeal to younger audiences. He said this at 2:47 in the afternoon. He said it in front of 3 other men. And he said it in a tone that Wayne, who had spent 32 years reading the difference between criticism and condescension, recognized without hesitation. Frank Belcher later said the room did not go silent, not immediately. There was a brief professional shuffle of papers, the kind of reflexive motion that people make when they want to create the impression of having somewhere specific to look. McCrary, to his left, went very still. The executive who had been speaking seemed to become aware, in the half-second after the words left his mouth, that he had miscalculated something. Wayne did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He looked at the executive with the particular quality of attention that people who worked around him always found difficult to describe. Not threatening, exactly not cold. More like the look of a man who has just registered the complete shape of a situation and is now deciding, quietly, what it requires. He said 4 words. "We're done for today." He stood up, gathered nothing. He had brought no papers. Put on his hat, thanked the other 2 executives by name, and walked out of the room. Belcher followed. McCrary followed. The meeting was over at 2:49 in the afternoon. It had lasted 49 minutes. In the elevator on the way down, Wayne said nothing. In the parking lot, he said nothing. At the corner of Santa Monica and La Pierre, he stopped walking, stood in the 87-degree heat with the Santa Ana wind moving around him, and looked at nothing for approximately 20 seconds. Then he said, to no one in particular, "It wasn't for them anyway." And here's what nobody on that sidewalk understood at the time. What Wayne himself may not have been able to name until weeks later, alone on an empty soundstage, is that he was not talking about the executives. He was not talking about the critics. He was not talking about the box office projections or the commercial crossover appeal or the younger audiences. He was talking about his father. Marion Robert Morrison was born on May 26, 1907, in Winterset, Iowa. His father was Clyde Leonard Morrison, a pharmacist, a gentle, largely unsuccessful man who moved his family from Iowa to California chasing a doctor's recommendation for his lungs, and who spent the remainder of his working life in modest circumstances in Glendale and Lancaster. Clyde Morrison died in 1937, 3 years before Stagecoach made his son a star. He never saw it happen. This is the fact that people who knew Wayne well, directors like John Ford, co-stars like Ward Bond, friends who had known him since the USC football days in the early 1920s, understood as the organizing wound of the man's life. Not a dramatic wound. Not a wound that Wayne ever discussed. A quiet wound, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that gets covered over by decades of hard work and professional achievement until it looks, from the outside, like simply the texture of the man. Clyde Morrison had believed in his son. The specific contours of that belief are not recoverable. There are no letters, no detailed accounts. What is recoverable is the fact that Wayne, throughout his career, maintained a habit that his crews found quietly unusual. At the end of major productions, before the final print was struck, he would spend an hour alone on the set. Not reviewing footage. Not talking with the director. Just sitting with the physical space where the work had been done. The Alamo had been his father's kind of story. Not in any literal sense. Clyde Morrison had no particular connection to Texas or to the events of 1836. But in the sense that The Alamo was a film about men who did the right thing when nobody was watching, who held a line not because they expected to win but because the line was worth holding. In that sense, it was a story for the kind of man Clyde Morrison had been. A quiet man. A man who tried and fell short and kept trying without making too much of it. Wayne had made the picture for the audience that didn't exist at the box office. He had made it for pharmacists in Iowa who died before their sons became famous. He had made it for men who did their best work in obscurity and were never told by a single authority that their best work was enough. Now it was autumn. Now the projections were in. Now 3 executives in suits had reviewed the evidence and rendered their verdict. And at 10:30 on the night of October 17th, 1960, John Wayne sat on an apple box in an empty soundstage and did the thing he had never permitted himself to do in public. He grieved. In the first few minutes, it was controlled. That particular form of controlled that is right at the edge of uncontrolled, where the breath is careful and the jaw is set and the body is still doing its part of the work. Wayne had lived his entire adult life inside that controlled space. He had been disciplined in it. He had built it brick by brick across 32 years and 153 films and a public image that was, by 1960, arguably the most recognizable face in the world. Then the control broke. Not dramatically. Not with a sound that would have carried through the stage door. It broke the way ice breaks on a river in late March. From the inside out, along the lines that had always been there, in the places that had always been weakest. The shoulders came forward. The hat, his hat, a working-grade Stetson he wore between takes, came off and rested across both knees, and his hands gripped it on either side. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about Clyde Morrison sitting in a drugstore in Lancaster, California, reading about his son in the movie magazines, the son who had left USC on a football scholarship and ended up on the back lots of Columbia and Fox doing bit parts and prop work. The son who had improbably, through John Ford and Raoul Walsh and the long, strange machinery of Hollywood chance, become something extraordinary. He was thinking about the fact that his father had never sat in a theater and watched Stagecoach, had never seen the way a camera could find his son in a doorway and make the world go quiet, had never understood, with the specific understanding that only a witnessing can provide, that all of it, the work, the discipline, the 32 years, had meant something. The Alamo was the proof he had wanted to send backward through time to a man who was gone. And the world had looked at the proof and moved on. That is what the crying was. Not self-pity. Not defeat. Something more precise and harder to dismiss. The specific grief of a person who makes something of lasting value and offers it to people who are not, in that moment, capable of receiving it. Wayne had known, in the rational part of his mind, that his father was dead and that the dead do not see films, and that the personal meaning of a piece of work is not the same thing as its commercial performance. He knew all of this. The heart does not operate in that department. He sat for approximately 40 minutes. The soundstage held him. Outside, the Burbank lot was empty except for a guard making his rounds on a 30-minute schedule, a fact Wayne would have known, having spent the better part of 3 decades on studio lots. He was, as always, aware of his environment. He had chosen this specific window, in this specific empty space, with the precision of a man who knows the value of privacy and engineers it deliberately. And then, at approximately 11:10, he reached the bottom of whatever it was. He sat up. He placed his hat back on his head. He set it the way he always set it, slightly forward, slightly to the left, the specific angle that had been, since the early 1940s, as identifiable as his voice. He put his hands on his knees and stood up in one motion, clean, deliberate, no hesitation, and picked up the apple box and put it back where it belonged, aligned with the row of other apple boxes against the wall of the stage. He turned off the maintenance lights. And he walked out. That is not a man who has been defeated. That is not a man performing recovery for an audience, because there was no audience. That is a man who has paid a debt, to himself, to a memory, to the specific weight of the thing he had carried for 12 years, and has then gotten back to work. Pete Salter, standing in the dark outside the stage door, heard the lights click off. He pressed himself back against the wall of the adjacent building. The stage door opened. Wayne walked out into the Burbank night, set his hat, and turned toward the parking lot without looking back. He passed within 6 feet of where Salter was standing. He did not see him. Or perhaps he did see him, registered the shape of a young man pressed against a wall at 11 o'clock at night, and made the quiet, generous decision not to. That was also something John Wayne would do. 3 weeks later, Pete Salter was back on the lot for pre-production work on the Comancheros. He was running cable on Stage 7 when Wayne came through on a walkthrough, with director Michael Curtiz. They were reviewing the set layout. Curtiz was talking. Curtiz was almost always talking, a stream of rapid, densely accented direction that his crews had learned to parse for the load-bearing information, and let the rest go. Wayne was listening in that way he had of listening, completely, without interrupting, his eyes moving around the physical space rather than at the speaker. He reached the end of the stage and turned and walked back. And as he passed Pete Salter, who was on one knee taping down a cable run, trying hard to look like a man entirely absorbed in the task of taping down a cable run, Wayne stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood. Then, "You're Salter. Electrics." It wasn't a question. Salter looked up. "Yes, sir." Wayne looked at him for approximately 3 seconds. Not a long time. Long enough to be unmistakable. Then he said, "Good work on the last picture." And he walked on. That was all. Curtiz had already moved on and was talking about the angle of the backing flat. A grip somewhere behind them was cutting lumber. The moment lasted 3 seconds and cost nothing. A sentence, a nod, a continuation. But here is what Pete Salter would say at that dinner table in Reseda, 31 years later, when he finally told his son what he had seen that night on stage for. "He knew I'd been there. I am certain he knew. And he never asked me to keep quiet about it, because he didn't need to. He just thanked me. For the work. For being someone who knew when to walk away. And I understood that. This is the thing that the executives in suits on the corner of Santa Monica and La Pier had missed. The thing that the critics who wrote about elephantine patriotism could not access because it was not in the film, precisely. It was underneath the film, in the ground the film was built on. Wayne made things that were meant to last. He understood the difference between the transaction, the box office, the reviews, the cultural moment, and the work itself. He had learned this distinction in the cheapest possible way. By watching his father do good, careful, honest work in a pharmacy in Lancaster and receive from that work a modest life and a modest reputation, and then death, without ceremony, in 1937. He had decided, at some point before Stagecoach, that the way to honor that was not to chase the transaction but to do the work. Every time, at the highest possible level, without regard for whether the moment was sufficient to receive it. The Alamo was that principle extended to its absolute limit. Some years later, in 1969, during the production of True Grit, the film that would finally bring Wayne the Academy Award, a young cinematographer named Lucien Ballard asked him about the Alamo, about whether he regretted the financial loss, about whether, knowing what he knew now, he would make the same choices. Wayne thought about it for longer than Ballard expected. Then he said, "Every man's got to have something he'd die for. Might as well be something worth dying for." He picked up his script sides and went back to work. That's not a performance. That's a philosophy. And the difference between those two things was the line Wayne had spent his entire life standing on. The line between the man the cameras saw and the man who sat alone on an apple box in the Burbank dark and paid his debt to the dead. He didn't move the way other men moved. Not in front of cameras. Not in boardrooms. Not in empty sound stages at 11 o'clock at night with nobody watching. Because there was always somebody watching. Even if it was only himself. Pete Salter worked in Hollywood for another 22 years. He moved from electrics into gaffer work and eventually into production management, finishing his career as the production manager on 11 films for a mid-sized independent company in Culver City. He was, by all accounts, one of the most respected operators in his department. Known for a particular quality that his crews always described the same way. He knew when to talk and when to keep quiet. His son, Thomas Salter, is currently a production designer in the industry. He has worked on feature films and limited series for the past 19 years. When a director or a producer pushes him toward choices he doesn't believe in, choices made for commercial reasons rather than the truth of the material, he declines, and he has a specific way of explaining why. He says, "The work is for the people it's for. Not everybody else." He got that from his father. His father got it from 11 seconds in a doorway in Burbank in October of 1960. The Alamo, which lost money in its initial 1960 release, was nominated for 7 Academy Awards that same year, including Best Picture. Over the following decades, it earned back its negative cost in international and ancillary markets. Today, it is considered one of the defining documents of mid-century American cinema. A film that serious film scholars study, not for its box office trajectory, but for the particular sincerity of its conviction. The thing the executives called its limitation turned out to be its permanence. In 1979, shortly before his death from cancer, John Wayne gave a final interview to Barbara Walters. She asked him if there was any film he regretted. He said no. She pressed him. What about the financial failures? What about the projects that hadn't worked out the way he hoped? He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention that photographers had been trying to capture for 40 years. He said, I never made a picture I was ashamed of. That's enough. He died on June 11th, 1979. He was 72 years old. Now come back to that frozen image. The empty soundstage. The amber maintenance lights. The biggest movie star in the world, alone on an Apple box, paying a debt that the rest of the world didn't know existed. What you are looking at is not weakness. What you are looking at is not a man broken by failure. What you are looking at is the one moment in a 50-year career when John Wayne allowed the gap between the transaction and the work, between the world's verdict and his own, to be felt at full scale. He felt it. He sat with it. He put his hat on and went back to work. That is the thing the cameras never captured. One man, one debt, one decision made alone in the dark that nobody saw. And that changed permanently everyone who eventually heard about it. Not from pain, from realization. 37 witnesses over 31 years. One who was there. And a lesson that almost disappeared with the generation that carried it. But there is one more thing about John Wayne and the Alamo that has never been publicly discussed. One conversation, not on a soundstage, not in a boardroom, that happened on the drive back from the UA offices that September afternoon. One exchange between Wayne and his attorney, Frank Belcher, that Belcher described only once, to a single person, under specific conditions. That's a story for another time.